What's going on, guys? My name is Rami, and welcome back to another episode of RQ's Garage, an automotive YouTube channel where I give you the ins and outs of car knowledge. And in today's episode, I'm going to teach you how to properly and safely install some brakes and rotors on your vehicle. And in today's vehicle, we're going to be working on a 2007 Acura TL. Yes, that is my car, very near and dear to my heart. And this job should work for most Honda or Acura vehicles, whether it's a Honda Accord, an Acura TL, a Honda Civic, and in most vehicles, it'll be the same system. But when you're doing this job on your vehicle, make sure you look up your vehicle specifications, especially when you're torquing the nuts and bolts down at the end of the job, just so it can be done safely. I'll be teaching you how to replace the rear brakes and rotors on my vehicle. And the rear braking system is a little bit different than the front because the emergency brake or the hand brake is involved in the rear system. So I'm gonna teach you how to inspect your parking brake. I'm gonna show you what looks good, what looks bad, if it needs replacing. I'm gonna show you the rotors and compare the new with the old, the brakes with the new and the old, and I'm gonna teach you all the steps that you'll need to do this job. Are you guys ready? Let's get after it. The tools you'll need for this job is a drill, screwdriver, a C-clamp, a wire brush. You're gonna need a 12, a 14, and maybe an 18 millimeter if some things start to get annoying, so bring that just in case. And if you don't have any wrenches, get some 12 and 14 millimeter sockets, a flat screwdriver, a mallet, some Loctite, some thread locker, brake lube, brake cleaner. You'll need a torque wrench to torque down the wheels when you're done, and the lug nuts are 3/4 inch. You'll need 2 jack stands, and you'll need a floor jack. First thing you'll need to do is chuck up the front wheels, because when you're lifting up the rear side of the vehicle, you don't want the front to move, and this is just extra security. So they have plastic chucks, but anything can work. And for me, I just have these extra bricks at my house, so these will do. Before we jack up the car, the first thing we have to do, as always, is unloosen the lug nuts on the wheel. So you want to turn them counterclockwise. And of course, on the other side as well. So just a quick note, when you have your car on jack stands, you want to give it a little push. Make sure the vehicle is secure. So you can see both jack stands are on both jack points on the vehicle. Next, we're going to unloosen the lug nuts and take off the wheel. Now what I like to do is put my wheel underneath the vehicle. That way, in case the jack stand fails, this can be kind of, a second way of protection, just in case. Just keep it in there out of the way. And of course, the other side. But with the magic of editing, so now that the wheel is off, we can see our rotor and we can see our caliper. The brakes are gonna be inside this caliper. There's gonna be one on the outside, one on the inside. And then the brakes are attached to this little bracket right here. So we're gonna take off the caliper housing and then the bracket housing. So we're on the inside right now. I don't know if you can see pretty well. These 2 bolts are holding the caliper, the top one, the bottom one. They're 12 millimeter bolts. So we're gonna get a wrench and we're just going to knock it off. They will need some persuasion. The 2 12 millimeter bolts are off, so we're gonna go and get the bracket bolts. There's one down here and one up here, and they're 14 millimeter bolts. And if you don't have a 14 millimeter wrench, you can just use a ratchet with a 14 millimeter socket. Yeah, this bad boy was on the bracket very, very tight. So we had to use a lot of persuasion to get it off. But let me show you what's going on here. All right, before we start, I just want you guys to always keep your nuts and bolts in orientation. Bottom bolt, top bolt for the bracket, bottom bolt, top bolt for the caliper. So here's our rotor, and right here are our brake pads. Here's the outer one and here's the inner one, okay? So when you brake, these two brake pads squeeze in onto the rotor. The rotor is moving freely with the wheel, and the friction of the brake pads squeezing onto the rotor when you press on the brakes will slow down the rotor and thus slow down your car. And this happens on all four wheels. Now, if we look over here onto the caliper, and by the way, guys, when you are putting the caliper off, make sure you're hanging it onto something on a suspension component. Do not, you see this little line right here? This line holds your brake fluid. Okay, and please do not let this bad boy be hanging out. You don't want to damage that brake line. It's actually very fragile. So mine's just sitting right here on the suspension components in my car. So how do the brake pads squeeze onto the rotor? Well, right here is a little piston, and this piston is hydraulically pressed. So when you're squeezing on the brakes, the piston will squeeze in, and when it squeezes in, it looks like a clamp. Basically, it's a clamp that goes over the brakes, and so when you're squeezing on your brakes, they'll squeeze in. And so that's kind of how brakes work. So right now, we have everything out. Here are our little two brake pads. We can just pop them right out. These are pretty bad. I will show you what they look like compared to the new ones. And here's the inner one. And here's the rotor. And this clip can just come right off. So here's a comparison of the old and the new. You can see that there's not much life left. So you can take a better look at the new one. So this little metal housing and this outside piece, this is called the shim. This is the housing of the brake pad, and this is the actual pad itself. This is the piece that's going to press onto the rotor. So right here, there's a lot of life, right? It looks pretty thick. We go to our old one, and we can see right away that it's reduced by a lot. And if we switch over to the outer brake pads, you can see right here, there's still a little bit of life left, but it's good that we're doing this job. So look at that, and then now look at the new one. Yep, tons and tons of brake life left. So we're going to definitely replace these old bad boys. Now we're gonna take off that rotor. So this rotor, as you can tell, is rusty. It's got two little screws right here. These screws are gonna be very fun to take off. And what we're gonna need, a screwdriver and a mallet should do it. So we're going to scratch off this idea because we have technology. Voila, the brake rotor is off. So let's recap so far. We have the brake pads are off. Here's our old rotor. The rotor is off, okay? And here is what it looks like inside the rotor. So these little shims right here, this is your emergency brake, okay? These little springs, everything included behind this hub right here is your emergency brake. So actually what happens is when you pull up the lever, or nowadays when you press the button, these shims are gonna move outwards. They're gonna squeeze out, and they're gonna grab on the inside of the rotor. And that will keep your brakes, that will keep your emergency brake held, right? So when you release that pressure, you press the button back to turn it off, or you press the handle down, these shims will push back in from these springs right here. So it actually doesn't look too bad. There's still life left on here. It looks pretty good. And these aren't really meant for a replacement. They're not a wear item. They're just used once in a while. Unless you drive with your emergency brake on, you might want to consider looking into this. Once or twice is not that big of a deal, but if it happens occasionally, it's not the best. But like I said, these aren't really a wear and tear item. We're just looking at it to inspect them. They look really good. I mean, there's some rust and dust, but that's normal with this mileage of a car. And they don't look too bad. So we're actually just going to clean this off with some brake cleaner. So while the emergency brake is drying off with the brake cleaner, let's take a look at our rotors. So as we can clearly see, we have an old rotor on the right and the new rotor on the left. And I like to compare them at the same orientation with the holes. And I took a photo of this rotor before we took it off the wheel. And yes, yeah, it's gonna be some fun, guys. So put some gloves on or just do what I do. But yeah, so we can see that the surface of the rotor is slotted. There is a lot of lines, very uneven. It's not dangerous, but it's not really the best per se. And we can see the new one, surface is very clean. It's machined, so it looks great. So just a little comparison side by side. Now, before we install the new rotors, we're gonna have to clean them off with some brake cleaner. The reason we're gonna do this is when these are stored at the shop or at a local parts store, they put grease on the surface, and that just helps so they don't get rusted up. So before we install it, we just wanna clean off that grease. So it's time to put on the new rotor, and I'm using little paper towels to keep it clean because my hands are not, clearly. So from my picture, I remembered how it went. And I'm going to install it the same way it came off. That towel got stuck in the back. Then I'll take my 2 screws, screw them back in. They don't need to be tight. Just make sure they're screwed on there, nothing much. Boom. Now, we can put back on the bracket. Sorry guys, I just put this off camera, but this little rubber cap is just a little through hole so you can see the emergency braking system. So you just pop it out with a little flathead screwdriver, you pop it out, you know, put it onto the new rotor and just squeeze it back in. Before we install the brakes, we have to look at this little bracket right here, okay? So this bracket has some little hardware, these little metal pieces. These brackets are made to hold the brakes in place. So whenever you buy brakes, make sure that you buy the specific hardware. So we're gonna match up the hardware and we're gonna put it on. I took out the hardware, I took out the pieces right here, and we're just gonna use a wire brush and just clean off any excess area, make it a nice smooth area. Take the hardware, the new hardware, and just pop it in. It's actually fairly simple. Just one little clip and one at the top. Make sure it's nice and tight. Now it's time to prep everything up before we put it in the vehicle. So this is brake lubricant. It stops brake noise from caliper sliding, and then you put it in all the contact points. So basically all the points that'll be in contact with the brakes. So we're gonna put some brake grease on this upper and lower hardware. We're gonna put some brake grease on the shims right here, on the outer shims, on this shim, on this little metal piece. Basically anything that's metal, we're gonna put some of this brake grease on. Will help with vibrations, so it's a smoother ride. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of heat being transmitted in the braking system, a lot of friction. So this is also gonna help dissipate heat. But just make sure you hit every piece of metal, every contact point. You wanna be extra careful with the brakes. Don't put any on the surface right here. Make sure you only hit the shims in the back, all metal pieces. Now it's important we have to tighten these properly and correctly. And in order to do that, we need some lubrication. We're gonna use a thread locker that will keep the bolts on there tight because there's so much vibration happening in the vehicle that we want to make sure that these won't unloosen. So we're going to use thread locker blue. So we're gonna put a little bit of this on the bolts. Just a little bit of Loctite to put on the bolts because when we screw them back on, the blue Loctite will go through the threads. So we're gonna put on a bracket. But before we put it on, just make sure you see these little rubber sliders. It's hard to focus, but just make sure they look all right. They should be, nothing wrong with them for the most part, but since it's off, just inspect them, make sure they both look good. And they're sliding fine. Now, when tightening up these bolts, you really should look online, or if you have your service manual, for the torque specifications on these bolts. Now, I have a torque wrench and I torqued them down really good, but if you don't have a torque wrench, make sure you have them on really tight. Give it some push so they're in tight. Now we can install the brake pads. The new rotor and the new pads, they're looking great. So we want to put this caliper back onto the bracket, but the old pads had less surface on them, which means this piston is pushed out more. So we can't put this caliper on here because there's more area. So we're going to have to compress this piston. And since we're here, we want to inspect this piston. Just look at the surface of it, make sure it looks nice and clean. The bushing looks fine. It should be. Again, this is something too concerning. But since we're down here, we just take a look at it. And if it looks bad, get a wire brush, brush it off, put some brake cleaner. Actually, I'll put some brake cleaner on this. So before we compress the piston, we have to understand that there are brake lines going to every brake. So there's hydraulic fluid going to that piston right there. So if we're going to compress the piston in, fluid is going to get pushed back to the main reservoir in the engine. So go to your engine, make sure you have the brake cap off. Whenever we compress that piston, fluid's going to push back into the reservoir so it's free. We don't want to pressurize the system because that's not going to be good. All right, so we want to compress the piston in, and it's really simple. Just take the old brake pad, put it on the surface of the piston, get a C-clamp, and just start squeezing it in. There it is. The piston is now compressed in, so we can take this off. We can attach it on. So now we'll come in with the two 12mm bolts, and I've seen people put some grease on these bolts, so we can put some grease and thread locker on them. That's not a big deal. The last thing we'll need to do to make this job complete is to compress the piston. And all you gotta do is press on the brake pedal. Take a listen, see if you can hear the piston compress. And there it is. That's the new rotor and pads on our car. The next thing we have to do is put on the wheel. And you know the deal. We just put the wheel back on, get the lug nuts, tighten them up a little bit with the little tool right there. And then we will start raising up the car to take out the jack stands so we can properly lower the car again. Yep, jack stand's coming off at a safe distance. We bring down the car to a safe level. And then finally, we're going to torque down the wheels to 95 foot-pounds. Finished our brake job, I decided to do some math. I have all the receipts from all the parts that I purchased for this job in the left, and in the right, I have a mechanic shop, and they gave me an estimate for a brake job for the rears. So we're gonna compare the prices of all the materials to a local shop and see how much money we saved. So in the shop estimate, they give me estimates for a wheel alignment for new tires, but we're just going to focus on the highlighted numbers down here. Their brake service, the rear brake service, they wanted to charge me $112.95. They wanted to charge the ceramic pads, which we also got ceramic pads, but they charged me $83.28. And they wanted the two rotors at $62.55 each for $125.10. So the total from the shop was
$321.33 for the brake job alone.
Now I calculated up all the receipts that we have. So for the rotors, we bought the rotors at $33.99 each for a total of almost 80 bucks. We bought the brakes for $27 total. They're also ceramic brakes, by the way. We bought the brake cleaner for $3. We bought the lubricant for $7.50 and the Loctite for $7.50. And the total for our job was $125. And that is a whopping $197, guys. We saved this much money on the brake job. That is freaking awesome. Well, guys, that is how you properly install brakes and rotors on the rear of a vehicle. Now, I worked on my Acura, but again, this system is relatively the same across the board on vehicles, so make sure you double check and look at yours online. And I really hope you learned something today with those brake pads squeezing onto the rotors and kind of getting a visual of how brakes work. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I hope you smash that subscribe button, and in the comments below, tell me what kind of vehicle you have and what kind of services you want to see do next. Now I'm gonna continue doing the other side of the vehicle. It's exactly the same. You're welcome to stick around for the time lapse, but if not, I'll see you on the next one.